In the early 1950s, the Cold War was reaching a boiling point, and the United States military was obsessed with a singular, terrifying goal: tactical nuclear supremacy. The Pentagon realized that while strategic bombers could level
Under cover
cities,
of night,
they
the
needed a more
behemoth rolled
precise,
through quiet
reliable,
streets,
and
an
unstoppable
80-foot
way
secret
to
draped
deliver
in
atomic
canvas.
fire directly to the
At
front
dawn,
lines.
the crew went to work.
The result of this
Steel
desperate
jaws
ambition
opened around the
was
size
the
of a man's slit
M65
home,
atomic
and they sealed
cannon,
the breach.
a machine of such
Then, with a
gargantuan proportions that it earned the nickname Atomic Annie. Inspired by the heavy railway guns of World War II, American engineers at the Picatinny Arsenal set out to build a mobile fortress, a 280mm cannon that could fire a 600-pound projectile tipped with a nuclear warhead over 20 miles away with surgical precision. It was an 85-ton monster of high-tensile steel, measuring 84 feet in length, designed to be the ultimate argument in any land-based conflict. Atomic Annie wasn't just a gun. It was a physical manifestation of the atomic age's most brutal philosophy: that the battlefield could be won through the sheer, overwhelming power of the atom. The engineering required to move and fire the M65 was a logistical masterpiece that pushed 1950s technology to its absolute limit. Because the gun was too heavy and too long for any single vehicle to transport, it was designed as a bimodal colossus. It was suspended between two massive, specially designed Kenworth 404 tractors, one at the front pulling and one at the rear pushing. These tractors could move the 85-ton assembly at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, allowing the M65 to navigate the highways and bridges of Europe and the United States. The coordination required between the two drivers was incredible. They communicated via a specialized intercom system to synchronize their steering and braking, making the Atomic Annie look like a giant, segmented mechanical dragon as it snaked through narrow mountain passes. Once it reached its firing position, a complex hydraulic system would lower the massive carriage to the ground, anchoring the gun's weight into the earth to prepare for the violent energy of a nuclear launch. The heart of the M65 was its 40-foot rifled barrel, a masterpiece of precision machining. To fire a nuclear shell, the barrel had to withstand internal pressures that would shatter conventional artillery. The rifling inside was designed to spin the W9 nuclear warhead at high speeds, stabilizing it in flight to ensure it hit its target with an accuracy of within a few hundred yards. The ammunition itself was a technological marvel. The W9 warhead was a 280mm artillery shell that packed a yield of 15 kilotons, roughly the same power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But while the Hiroshima bomb required a massive B-29 bomber, Atomic Annie could deliver that same destruction from the back of a truck in any weather, day or night. It was a terrifying evolution of the big gun concept, a machine that turned the ancient art of ballistics into a delivery system for the apocalypse. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and stay with us until the very end, because you are about to see the only time in history a live nuclear shell was fired from a cannon during the legendary Grable test and the secret radiation shield protocols that the crews had to follow to survive their own weapon. If you are fascinated by the giants of the Cold War and the machines that were built to hold the line at any cost, you are in the right place. We are loading the chamber of the nuclear Goliath. The internal life of an Atomic Annie crew was one of constant high-stakes drills and mechanical maintenance. A team of 5 to 7 soldiers was needed just to operate the hydraulic loading tray and the massive breech block. Every movement had to be perfectly synchronized. The process of loading a 600-pound nuclear shell involved specialized hoists and a ramming mechanism that looked like it belonged in a high-tech factory rather than a muddy battlefield. The soldiers worked in the shadow of the massive barrel, knowing that a single mechanical failure or a mistake in calculating the wind and elevation could mean the difference between a successful strike and a catastrophic accident. The M65 was a high-tension masterpiece, a machine that required absolute human discipline to control the raw, chaotic power of the atom. It stood as a warning to the world. The era of conventional warfare was over, and the era of the nuclear giant had begun. The mechanical violence of firing a 280mm projectile was something for which traditional ballistics were simply not prepared. When Atomic Annie unleashed its fury, the energy released during the recoil was enough to potentially flip a standard heavy vehicle. To counteract this, American engineers developed a revolutionary double recoil system. As the shell left the muzzle at a velocity of over 2,000 feet per second, the barrel itself would slide back on a massive hydraulic carriage, while the entire 85-ton mounting would shift along a secondary rail system. This complex dance of sliding steel and hydraulic fluid absorbed the literal tons of kinetic energy that would otherwise have shattered the gun's frame. The ground beneath the gun would vibrate so intensely that dust and stones would dance in the air for hundreds of feet around the firing site. It was a machine that fought against physics every time the trigger was pulled, a mechanical struggle to contain the explosive force required to hurl a nuclear warhead across the horizon. The sighting and guidance systems of the M65 were equally advanced for 1953, relying on a sophisticated blend of optical precision and early mechanical computers. To ensure that a nuclear warhead landed exactly where it was intended and not on friendly troops, the crew used a T-131 panoramic telescope and a series of ballistic calculators. These men had to factor in air temperature, humidity, wind speed at various altitudes, and even the curvature of the Earth. A single degree of error at the muzzle would result in a miss of several hundred yards at the target, a margin that was unacceptable when dealing with tactical nuclear yields. The gunners of Atomic Annie were more like mathematicians than traditional soldiers. They operated in an atmosphere of cold, calculated precision, knowing that they held the power of a localized apocalypse in their hands. The M65 wasn't just a dumb iron tube, it was a high-precision delivery platform, a bridge between the era of manual artillery and the coming age of guided missiles. In the mid-1950s, the U.S. military made a decision that would send shockwaves through the geopolitical landscape. They decided to deploy the M65 to West Germany. This was the beginning of the secret shield operation. At least 20 of these 85-ton monsters were shipped across the Atlantic, hidden beneath massive tarps on the decks of heavy lift vessels. Once in Europe, they were stationed in high-security bases, ready to move at a moment's notice to the Fulda Gap, the predicted path of a ground invasion. The sight of these massive dual-tractor convoys snaking through quiet German villages in the dead of night was a terrifying reminder of the high stakes of the Cold War. The M65 was a visible deterrent, a weapon that was meant to be seen and feared. Its presence told the world that the U.S. Army was prepared to use nuclear fire as a standard battlefield tool, blurring the line between conventional defense and total atomic war. The logistics of keeping these cannons mobile in Europe were a nightmare. The M65 required a specialized, heavy maintenance wing for every battery. Because the gun was so heavy, it could only cross certain reinforced bridges, and its turning radius was so vast that entire roads often had to be cleared of civilian traffic just to let the nuclear dragon pass. The two drivers of the M10 and M249 tractors had to be perfectly in sync. The rear driver sat in a cab facing backward, steering the rear wheels of the carriage to prevent the 80-foot assembly from clipping corners or sliding into ditches. This was precision driving on a titanic scale, a feat of coordination that required months of specialized training. The men who drove Atomic Annie were the elite of the Transportation Corps, responsible for a payload that could vaporize a city. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the M65's deployment was the nuclear readiness protocol. The crews lived in a state of permanent, hot standby. The W9 nuclear shells were stored in specialized, climate-controlled bunkers nearby, guarded by elite security teams. During drills, the shells were transported to the gun in lead-lined canisters, and the crew practiced the rapid response cycle, unhooking the tractors, lowering the gun to its firing platform, loading the 600-pound projectile, and calculating the firing coordinates, all in under 15 minutes. They were practicing for a world that would disappear the moment they actually did their job for real. The Atomic Annie was a masterpiece of 1950s industrial power, a machine built for a war that everyone hoped would never happen. Yet everyone was preparing to fight with the most brutal tools ever devised. May 19, 1953, marked the most terrifying day in the history of field artillery. At the Nevada Proving Grounds, under a sky so clear it looked artificial, the M65 Atomic Annie was prepared for its ultimate test, Operation Upshot Knothole Grable. This was not a simulation. This was the first and only time a live nuclear artillery shell would be fired from a cannon. Thousands of American soldiers were stationed in trenches just a few miles from the target zone, participating in an exercise to see how infantry would move across a fresh atomic battlefield. The tension at the firing site was suffocating. The crew of Atomic Annie, dressed in standard fatigues and steel helmets, moved with mechanical precision. They loaded the W9 nuclear shell, a 600-pound cylinder of steel and enriched uranium, into the massive breach. As the countdown reached 0, the order, "Fire!" echoed across the desert, and the M65 unleashed a sound that observers described as the sky itself being torn in half. The physics of that moment were staggering. The massive 280-meter barrel recoiled with such violence that it seemed to disappear into its own carriage for a split second. A giant ring of fire and dust erupted from the muzzle as the shell was hurled into the air at over 2,000 feet per second. The projectile traveled for 19 seconds, arching 7 miles across the Nevada flats. Then, at an altitude of exactly 524 feet above the target area, the nuclear warhead detonated. The resulting 15-kiloton explosion produced a blinding flash that was brighter than 1,000 suns, instantly followed by a towering mushroom cloud that rose 30,000 feet into the air. For the men in the trenches, the world became a hellscape of heat and sound. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall, throwing dust and debris into the air while the thermal pulse charred the desert vegetation in an instant. The Grable test proved that the M65 was not just a theory, it was a functional, lethal reality of the nuclear age. The accuracy of the shot was terrifyingly perfect. The shell detonated within yards of its intended coordinates, demonstrating that the atomic cannon offered a level of precision that contemporary ballistic missiles simply could not match. From his observation post, General J. Lawton Collins remarked that this was a new era of land warfare. To the U.S. military leadership, the Grable test was a triumph of American engineering. They had taken the raw, chaotic power of the Hiroshima bomb and tamed it, shrinking it down into a package that could be aimed with the same precision as a sniper rifle. But for the world watching the grainy black and white footage of the blast, the message was much darker. It showed that the threshold for nuclear war had been lowered. No longer was an atomic strike a last resort delivered by a strategic bomber. It was now a tactical option for a colonel on a muddy battlefield. Inside the technical reports of the Grable test, scientists noted the electromagnetic pulse (EMP) effect and the immediate radiation fallout. The area around the blast became a hot zone of lethal intensity. Yet, as part of the exercise, American troops were ordered to move toward the mushroom cloud, testing their radiation suits and their psychological endurance. They were walking into the future of war, a world where the ground itself was a silent killer. The M65 had done its job perfectly, but in doing so, it had created a logistical paradox. How do you occupy a territory that you have just vaporized with your own artillery? The Atomic Annie was a masterpiece of absolute destruction, but it raised questions about the survival of the human race that no general or scientist could answer. The footage of the Grable blast became one of the most iconic and haunting images of the Cold War. It showed the M65 standing proud in the desert, its massive barrel still smoking, while the horizon was consumed by a nuclear firestorm. This single shot transformed Atomic Annie into a global celebrity, a symbol of American technological dominance that was featured in newsreels across the planet. But behind the propaganda, the reality was a constant struggle with the nuclear logistics chain. Moving a live nuclear shell through a combat zone required a level of security and specialized handling that strained the Army's capabilities to the breaking point. The M65 was a titan of steel, but it was also a prisoner of its own lethal cargo. The success of the Grable test was the peak of the Atomic Annie's career, but it was also the beginning of the end for the big gun era as the shadow of the missile age began to loom over the Nevada desert. After the terrifying success in the Nevada desert, Atomic Annie became the ultimate deterrent on the European front. This marked the beginning of the most complex logistical game in military history: nuclear Tetris. By 1955, 20 M65 cannons had been deployed to West Germany, split into several specialized batteries. Every relocation of this 85-ton behemoth was a high-stakes military operation of the highest secrecy. To deceive Soviet spies and intelligence, the guns were often moved under the cover of darkness, draped in massive canvas tarps that altered their silhouette to look like harmless bridge-building cranes or heavy construction trailers. But hiding such a monster was nearly impossible. When the two Kenworth T10 and M249 tractors, each pumping out 375 horsepower, roared into life, the thunder of their engines could be heard for miles. This was a steel caravan over 80 feet long, requiring a perfectly calculated route. Every turn through the narrow cobblestone streets of German villages was a trial of nerves for the drivers, where a single inch of error could result in a collapsed house or an 85-ton nuclear asset sliding into a ditch. The technical maintenance of these specialized Kenworth tractors was a unique form of mechanical hell. Designed specifically for this project, they featured a revolutionary but temperamental drive and steering system. While the front tractor pulled, the rear tractor pushed, and the rear driver sat facing backward, steering the rear axle of the carriage through a complex series of mirrors and a dedicated intercom system. Any desynchronization in engine RPM or braking pressure could cause the steel bridge of the cannon to snap the couplings or literally crush one of the driver cabs. Mechanics worked 24/7, obsessively checking every hydraulic line and every heavy-duty bolt. Atomic Annie was so heavy that the asphalt would often crack under its wheels, and many ancient bridges in rural Germany had to be reinforced with temporary steel beams before the battery was cleared to cross. This wasn't just an artillery unit. It was a mobile engineering corps constantly at war with gravity and the fragile infrastructure of post-war Europe. But the heaviest burden was the nuclear secret of the shells themselves. The W9 warheads could not simply be transported with the gun. They traveled in separate, elite-guarded convoys inside specialized climate-controlled trucks, as the electronics and the high-explosive lenses of the nuclear core were extremely sensitive to vibration and temperature fluctuations. At every deployment site, the crew practiced the Rapid Assembly Protocol. It was a titanic dance. The tractors would unhook, the massive hydraulic jacks would lower the 85-ton platform to the earth, the steel stabilizing spades would bite into the soil, and the gargantuan loading tray would lift the 280mm shell to the breech. This entire process had to be completed in under 15 minutes. The soldiers knew the grim reality. In a real war, they were priority 1 targets for the Soviet Air Force. Their only job was to fire the first and last nuclear salvo before their position was vaporized by counter-battery fire. The psychological pressure on the M65 crews was monumental. They were the elite, but they were also essentially on a suicide mission. Within every unit, a strict 2-man rule existed for any access to the nuclear shells or the firing codes. The guns were constantly on the move, leapfrogging from one secret forest bunker to another so that the enemy never knew the exact location of the nuclear threat. This was a permanent state of high-tension readiness. Even during routine drills, the soldiers felt the crushing weight of their responsibility. They were operating a machine that could erase an entire division or turn a lush valley into a radioactive wasteland with a single pull of the trigger. The M65 became the symbol of tactical apocalypse, a machine that demanded absolute discipline and staggering technical effort just to maintain its status as the most feared ghost of the Cold War. Despite its overwhelming power, the M65 was a prisoner of its own size. Internal Pentagon reports began to emerge, suggesting that the system's mobility was largely an illusion. In the actual chaos of a hot war, destroyed roads and refugee traffic would make moving 85-ton convoys impossible. The era of missilization had begun. While Atomic Annie stood watch in Germany, the first guided missiles were already taking flight on test ranges, weapons that could carry the same nuclear yield, but were 10 times lighter and significantly more mobile. The M65 was becoming a slow giant in a world that had started moving at supersonic speeds. Nevertheless, until its final decommissioning in 1963, it remained the most impressive artillery piece in existence, a steel fist that was too big to ignore and too terrifying to ever use outside the Nevada desert. The end of the M65 Atomic Annie came not with a bang, but with the silent hiss of a hydraulic press. By 1963, the strategic landscape of the Cold War had shifted irrevocably. The development of the Honest John and Little John rockets, along with the first tactical missiles like the Sergeant, made the 85-ton M65 look like a relic from a Napoleonic era that had somehow survived into the space age. A missile could be hidden in a standard truck, launched from almost anywhere, and didn't require 2 massive tractors and a 20-man engineering crew just to turn a corner. The U.S. Army officially retired the M65, and the 20 Titans that had spent a decade haunting the forests of Germany and the deserts of Nevada were ordered back to the United States. It was the end of the era of the big gun, a moment when the military realized that raw mechanical mass was no longer a match for the speed and precision of solid-fuel rocketry. But the fate of the 20 original guns is a story of mechanical resurrection and preservation. Of the 20 units produced, only 8 remain today, scattered across the United States in various military museums. The most famous of them all, the original Atomic Annie that fired the live nuclear shell during the Grable test, was rescued from a scrapyard and now stands as a silent sentinel at the U.S. Army Artillery Museum in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. When you stand beneath its massive 40-foot barrel today, the sheer physical presence of the machine is overwhelming. It is a monument to a time when American industry believed it could solve any problem by building something bigger, heavier, and more powerful than anything else on Earth. The M65 remains a masterpiece of industrial art, its gears and pistons frozen in time, a reminder of the day when the desert floor of Nevada was scorched by an artillery-delivered sun. The legacy of the M65 is a chilling lesson in technological extremism. It was a weapon that pushed the concept of field artillery to its absolute breaking point. It proved that we could shrink a nuclear bomb into a 280 shell, but it also proved that the logistics of such a weapon were fundamentally incompatible with the reality of modern fast-moving warfare. The Atomic Annie was a steel paradox. It was the most powerful weapon in the Army's arsenal, yet it was so cumbersome that it could barely move when it was needed most. It was a machine built for a war of total annihilation, yet its very existence was meant to ensure that such a war would never happen. It stands as a symbol of the nuclear deterrent at its most visceral and mechanical, a weapon so terrifying that its silence was its greatest victory. Today, as the world enters a new era of military tension, the ghost of the M65 is returning in the form of hypervelocity projectiles and long-range electromagnetic railguns. The dream of delivering massive destruction through a gun barrel is not dead, it has simply evolved. But the raw, unrefined power of Atomic Annie will likely never be seen again. There is something uniquely terrifying about an 85-ton machine that uses high explosive powder to hurl a nuclear reactor across the horizon. The M65 was the pinnacle of the cult of the cannon, a final, desperate gasp of the big gun philosophy before it was swallowed by the digital age of silent, invisible missiles. It remains the ultimate monster of the Cold War, a machine that changed the history of the world with a single shot and then disappeared into the mist of history. As we look at the rusting steel of these retired giants, I want you to ask yourself a question that still haunts military planners. Was the M65 a brilliant deterrent that successfully prevented a Soviet invasion of Europe? Or was it a dangerous, expensive toy that brought the world closer to a nuclear catastrophe than we care to admit? And tell me, if artillery could fire clean tactical weapons today, would the era of the big gun return, or is the age of the missile truly supreme? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think Atomic Annie was a work of genius or a work of madness. If you survived this deep dive into the radioactive heart of the U.S. Army, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. We are the channel that uncovers the gigantic monsters that were built to fire the apocalypse. See you in the next one, when we crack open the vault of history once again.